Thank you so much, Lucy. And hey, good morning to you, Craig. You're coming to us from Portland, which means it is a spine-tingling 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yes, it is. It's a very, very new experience for me.
So first, I want to apologize for that.
No problem, none whatsoever. I should have had this experience a long time ago, but I've been putting it off. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, as Lucy said, please let us know where you're zooming in from. I just see Christina Panchik just said hello from Denver, and the art museum is reopening today there. So that's great. It's good to see cultural venues cautiously opening their doors. Uh,
absolutely.
yeah. So please let us know where you're zooming in from, and also if you have questions, put them in the chat box anytime. We'll get back to them at the end of the talk. Craig, we can jump right into images if you want. We're going to be talking about some extremely pertinent and topical material having to do with urban space and the way that communities of color have essentially creatively infused urban space with possibility. I don't know if you want to open up with any.
I do. I do. I have some sort of contextual comments that I'd like to make, and then we can go into the images.
Perfect.
So, when I was first approached to participate in this conversation, I was pleased and honored to have been asked. But I really wanted to know. Well, I mean, I can talk about a lot of things. Some of them are maybe not pertinent to what this forum is about, and the response was, well, we want to talk about hip hop architecture, and so I said, okay, fine. So we're going to talk about that, but to make this a little bit more, understandable, I'm going to sort of back up a bit to try to get everybody on the same page as fast as I can, and then so you can kind of understand the work that you might see afterwards, and then we can have a conversation about that. Okay, so to get to the efficacy of hip hop architecture, I have to sort of back up like a lot. And I hope this won't bore you or those who are in attendance, but this overview is actually kind of necessary to understand its birth and development. So if you indulge me while I walk you through a rather broad and at times maybe esoteric set of ideas that I think it will help put the theory in context and make it more useful for us to talk about. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with me about this line of thinking, but simply to consider the philosophical, ideological, historical, and practical lineage from which it comes. So with that said, we can go to the first image. So this conversation really, when I'm thinking about, oh darn, I lost my notes again. When I'm thinking about hip hop architecture, we're really talking about space, right? How space is organized, who has access to it, who does not have access to it, and space. I say this to my students a lot: is space is life. It is the place from which all our other benefits flow. Our access to healthy environments, our access to financial rewards, our access to leisure. All these things come from our ability to access space. So when you think about it, what are we saying when you say that I'm a Chicagoan, or I'm a New Yorker, or I'm a Bostonian? You are literally saying you are space. You are from a particular place, and you are taking on all the connotations that name, that ownership, that claim provides. So it's not a really esoteric thing. It is a very real thing. Space is life. It provides us our identity. It allows us to be our best selves. And so, in a sense, space is power. If you can control space, you can control people. And so you can control their access to the benefits of life. So, and one way, and the primary way in which we talk about space, or the way in which space is constructed, is there is a normative space that, ostensibly everyone has access to. And that comes with rules, that comes with stated and unstated behavioral requirements. Certain rituals can happen in those spaces. Certain rituals aren't supposed to happen in those spaces. And then there's everything else, which is considered the invalid use of space, or the illegitimate use of space, or the incorrect use of space. Next slide. So you can do, when you are faced with perhaps being on the outside of the normative space for whatever reason, whether you don't feel comfortable in that space, whether you're not allowed into that space, whether you have been confined to the illegitimate. What is happening to those people is that they aren't able to live their best life. They are not able to access the kinds of benefits that come from space. And so you really have maybe three options at that point. The first option is to next slide, is to perhaps mimic, right? In the quote unquote illegitimate space, you create things that replicate the normative space. You do the same kinds of rituals, you do the same kinds of behaviors, hoping that at some point, those that police the boundaries of normative space will look at you and say, you know what, you're worthy. We're going to allow you into the normative space. That requires you to be, in a sense, complicit. You sort of have to, you become a supplicant. You actually wait for recognition. Often that recognition never comes, or never comes fully, but there's a kind of powerlessness in that, because you are always waiting for someone to recognize you and to acknowledge you and to accept you. Next slide. The second way in which you might respond to being on the outside of the benefits of space, next slide, is to insist. Like, you might decide that, you know what, I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of waiting. I belong in the normative space, and I am going to insist that that you let me in. Next slide. So this is where this is the space of protest. This is the space of rebellion. This is the space of confrontation and conflict. It is a moment where those on the outside realize that those within normative space are never going to recognize them on their own. And so they have to make their presence felt. And in a sense, they are arguing for or protesting for the benefits of life, basically. And so that's kind of where we are right now. You look outside, and maybe not, I'm not sure where you are, but You know, the streets are on fire. People are marching because they realize that they are being treated differently. They do not have access to the benefits of space. This whole argument about, you know, a border wall is about space. That's really what it's about. You stay over there. You don't have access to what we have here. So this is sort of the second way in which people can respond. It is to insist. Next slide. Another way to respond is that you just simply reject the idea that anybody anywhere can deny you anything when it comes to life. That I don't have to ask for permission to live. I'm not going to follow the rules that you have made up and the rules that you have made up that benefit you and disadvantage me. I'm not going to allow you to I don't know what the right term would be, legislate me out or in any way, shape, or form deny me my right to life. Next slide. So in this sense, this response is a rejection of any sort of normative use at all. That it is, well, I mean, that's probably a little broader than I want. It's a rejection of the rules that define what normative space is, because it doesn't benefit them, and they're not going to allow it. Next slide. So, in a sense, those who reject that space or reject the idea of normative space or reject the idea of the limitations placed on normative space that limit their ability to live, they make their space the normative space. And what was normally or previously thought of as that becomes the abnormal space. So they completely reject the idea that I have to be allowed in or I have to insist. I just don't respond. I just create what I need to create for me to live, and I dare you to tell me that I can't do it. Next slide. And so this is the position in which, in a sense, hip hop architecture lives. It's born. Its foundation is in this rejection of the idea that normative space has to be a space that limits or ill-defines or has to be applied for. It just doesn't accept that. It doesn't accept that on its face, because it has seen what that kind of approach does. Like I mean, this is a really useful quote. I mean, anything that James Baldwin says, I think, is a useful quote. But he said one time, he said, "Listen, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do." And this is, in a sense, the same kind of thinking. It's like, I don't believe in your normative boundaries because I see how they hurt me. Why would I accept that? Why would anybody accept that? So next slide. So this is the space in which hip hop was born, and this is sort of the space in which infuses hip hop architectural theory and thinking. It's a place where theorists, designers, artists, community people, and sort of different no, what's the right term? Different marginalized, let's say that, just marginalized folks outside of the boundaries of what is considered normative space, come together and begin to sort of think about, well, what can we do? Let's not worry about whether we're allowed or whether we're not allowed, because we don't really care about that. What we really care about is trying to help each other. We're trying to support each other to access what benefits we can access from space and place. Next slide. So one of the reasons that hip hop has been intriguing to this sort of cadre of folks who have gathered around this idea is that hip hop has actually created a culture of its own, right? And most people think about hip hop and they think about rap. And there was on the slide before, there's this famous quote by KRS-One. It says, "Rap is something you do, but hip hop is something you live." So hip hop actually has rules of engagement. It has its own language. It has its own behavior. It's got values. It has a material production. There are rituals involved. There are ways in which space is typically used. It has a visual aesthetic to it. That all that combined, that is a culture. That is what a culture is. And so every culture has produced its own sort of material products, whether it's books, whether it's music, whether it's language, but it's also produced its own architecture. And so, so should hip hop. And at the base of what this community is this idea of empowerment, this idea of respect, this idea of entrepreneurship, of ownership, because they had to. Hip hop was born in places that were literally forgotten, that were overlooked, that were written off. So what do you do? Again, we go back to the rejection. What do you do when you are in a space that is so completely outside the normative as to almost be non-existent? Well, you create your own. You create your own space. You create your own quote unquote normative place. Because to not do that is to die. Space is life, and I don't know how other way to put that. Next slide. So a lot of times when I talk about hip hop and other folks talk about hip hop, they, oh well, that doesn't make any sense, and that's about music, and how can that be termed an ideology in which you can create architecture? Well, we've had these kinds of movements before in the field. So, early century, we had in the new Soviet Union, or the emerging Soviet Union, constructivism, right? And this was a desire to create a classless society. It was a desire to create a worker's paradise, for lack of a better term. And there was an architecture that reflected that. And that is exactly what architects and artists in that time were trying to produce. They were trying to produce a physical manifestation of that ideological project. Next slide. Mid-century, we had modernism, right? And modernism is an attempt, again, to to create a universal society, to perhaps do away with the idea of maybe not so much class, but do away with things like waste, and become much more an efficient society, and raise the standard of living for everybody, to do away with these sort of historical foundations that sort of divide folks or stratify folks, trying to create a kind of democratic order. And we can talk about the failures of modernism and how it was usurped and all the other sorts of things, but that's not what this conversation is about. Next slide. So late century, we get to deconstructivism, which for me is like sort of throwing up my hands and just say, you know what? We can't do anything. We can't fix anything. The first two were literally about trying to create a new way of living, a new person, a new citizen, and a new society. Of course, they never asked the people. It was a top down, but that was the goal, right? We're gonna reshape the world in a manner in which we think will make it a better place. And after the collapse or the failure of modernism and that particular promise, the late century saw the field go like, you know what, forget it. We can't do anything. We don't know anything. There's nothing can be known. I mean, how arrogant is that? Just because you don't know it, nobody else can. Anyway, we're just not going to do anything. And so the goal went from trying to create a classless society or universal society to a decentered society. Something that just says, well, everybody fend for yourself. There is no meaning. Meaning is always receding. And so why bother? So now, next slide, we get to this century. And, we're proposing hip-hopism. It's an effort to find full participation of the marginalized and disenfranchised. It is an attempt to create a just society, a society that is inclusive, a society that allows for sort of different ways of living, that doesn't, in a sense, label or dismiss things that come perhaps directly from communities that have been distressed. And so, when folks say that, hip hop, this is about music, it's not about music. It's about justice. It's about community. It's about empowerment. It's about self-sufficiency. That's what it's about. If you won't, then we will. There isn't any argument here. That it's going to happen because it has to happen. Okay, next slide. So when you get to looking at architecture, right? So these are some of the things that sort of hip hop talks about, some of the things that, a just society sort of requires us to address. Things like wealth inequity, environmental justice, food security, mass incarceration, population explosion. Next slide. But these things lie on the boundaries, the outside of what architecture tends to engage. Both in its application, its building, its theory, what it thinks about, and its pedagogy, what it teaches. Right? It doesn't teach things like communal empowerment, environmental sustainability, and a little bit. entrepreneurship. It doesn't do those things. But that's what hip hop architecture is. That's where hip hop architecture lives. Next slide. So what we're trying to do is trying to expand the boundaries of architecture so that it does include these kinds of questions, these kinds of concerns, and in the process, expand the definition of the object. The object may not necessarily be a building. It may not necessarily be something that we have seen before. And if that is the case, why should we not consider that being architecture? And again, we can debate that position, but this is the position in which hip hop architecture finds itself. It's arguing for. It is exploring. Next slide. So, in essence, say definitely recently, but probably all through its existence, the practice of architecture has been about the visual aesthetic. It certainly has, since the advent of magazines and news sites, we see the building. We don't see the things that go on behind it. We don't see how it gets made. We just see the finished product, or at least a rendering or a sketch or drawing of what a finished product is. It's really all about the visual aesthetics. And what hip hop architecture is attempting to do is to infuse that visual aesthetics with visible ethics, things that you can see, that this is about more than the thing. It is about trying to make a just society. That this isn't just about the pretty shiny object. It's about how that pretty shiny object comes about, its labor practices, its location in places that tend to begin gentrification. It's about all these things. It's about the ethics of production, and who gets to have a say in that, because space is life. Next slide. Oh, okay, we can skip that one. So, I know that typically what happens is, for me at least, is that folks will always say, well, what does it look like? What does it look like? I want to see what it looks like. And I've consistently refused to engage that question. Not because I can't give you an answer, because I don't want to give you an answer. Because if I give you an answer, then you don't do the work. Then you don't think about why this might be something of use. If I give you an answer, you get to sit in judgment, say, oh, I like that, I don't like that, that makes sense, that doesn't make sense, without the proper context. And I'm just not gonna allow you to do that. Maybe somebody else will, but I'm not gonna allow you to do that. I can't tell you how many times I've been, I've gotten calls from real estate developers who go like, oh, what is this hip hop architecture thing you're talking about? This sounds really kind of cool. And I'm like, yeah, you can miss me with that. I'm not the one to have this conversation with you, because I know what you're gonna do. You're gonna try to commodify it. You're gonna try to name it, and you're gonna try to make it hip, and you're gonna sell it. And that is the exact opposite of what hip hop architecture is about. So I'm not the one to be put in that position to sort of say, this is what it looks like. And another reason why is because I would argue there really isn't one formal definition, at least not yet, if you think about the sort of the teleology of hip hop in general, there's genres, there's subgenres, there are different sort of ways in which people participate in the culture, certainly in the music. And I just don't think I'm not the one to sort of say, this is what it is. That's sort of anti-communal. It's anti-group. And that's kind of how hip hop architecture and hip hop itself is born. So I feel very uncomfortable with that. However, I know that's not going to satisfy most people. So I want to introduce you to the first ever hip hop architectural exhibit that in the world, actually, that was hosted by the AIA New York Center for Architecture back in October of 2018. It was curated by Sekou Cook, who is an architect and a academic at Syracuse University. He curated, I think it was over 100 projects around the world that that sort of embodied a lot, if not all, of what the hip hop architectural movement is arguing. It was very well received. Next slide, please. It had a number of different write-ups everywhere. He is now in the process of finishing a book about hip hop architecture, and there is a catalog that I believe you can actually purchase. There's a lot, if not all, of the projects that were exhibited at the Center for Architecture in the catalog. I mean, it's a limited run, like all sort of art exhibit books are, but you might be able to still find one. So, I mean, if you're really sort of interested in sort of looking at what the object tends to, or has tended to look like, or in what direction it's moving, I would point you to those resources. Next slide.
Craig, can I just ask a quick question while we have this slide on the screen? I'm sure many people will be reading these amazing texts, which have this real kind of power and beauty to them, like this one that we see in front of us. I promise you I will never fit into your descriptions. I'm giant, etc. And I'm just wondering what the source of those texts was.
In front of me right now?
Yeah. Words in general for the exhibition, how were those generated, and were
the ones were in the Minnesota Post piece. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean actually written on the walls.
Yes, that was shown in the Minnesota Post.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
That was so that's the second location for the exhibit. It opened in New York, and then it moved to St. Paul and Minneapolis. This is the venue in St. Paul, and there were Sekou hired local graffiti artists to actually do the graffiti on the walls in the place. So
and they also composed the language.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So I did want to point out a couple things, though, just again, because I'm pretty sure that even being pointed to those resources are not satisfying enough. Just a couple projects. This one here is a proposal by James Garrett Jr., who is a principal at Formula Architecture in St. Paul. He's also he's one of that cadre of hip hop architecture thinkers and debaters and engagers and doers, along with Sekou, Amanda Williams, Andres Hernandez, Nate Johnson. I'm going to forget somebody, I'm sure, and please forgive me. Michael Ford, and Lek Jaifus. But this is a project done by James. It's for a cultural arts center in Minneapolis called Juxtaposition Arts. And they're raising funds for this project right now. But James is also an accomplished graffiti artist. And so the idea behind this project is actually taking his unique graffiti style and using that as a lens to kind of create this architectural object. And the colors that you see at the bottom are intended to demonstrate that, like hip hop and like graffiti, things change. So these colors will rotate in this particular architectural project, depending on a lot of different things, depending on the type of day, the level of sun, all these sorts of things that kind of influence the life of people will also influence the life of this particular building. Next slide. This is some early renderings these are some early renderings of the hip hop the Universal Hip Hop Museum that will be opening in the Bronx sometime in, I think, 2022, I think. Mike Ford was the lead designer on this particular project. He just recently left Smith Group, so I don't know if he's still on this particular project or not. But this is also something that will be completed fairly soon, that also tends to try to embody some of the ideas behind hip hop architecture as well. But I did this simply to be fair to folks who have decided they wanted to spend their time here and actually wanted to see some sort of objective image of what this stuff might be. But I want to spend the next, hopefully 5 minutes or so, just talking about two smaller projects that I think really kind of embody this idea of space, place, ownership, and rejection, for lack of a better term. So the next slide, please. So one of the things that makes hip hop, for me, very intriguing is that, it has taken dated technology, things that were not necessarily supposed to be used in the manner in which they're being used. And it's taken sort of this disposable and made it indisposable. So, turntables aren't supposed to be active instruments. They are supposed to be passive things. You put a record on it, put a needle down, you sit back, and you let the thing do its job. But through a series of events, CDs and other things that became readily available in the 80s, turntables weren't always the first choice of people. And the new shiny thing, you get rid of your turntable, you have a CD player. So this was available to folks who were just beginning to become immersed in the hip hop culture. So they took a discarded instrument or object and turned it into something indisposable. And it's that uniqueness, that sort of creativity, that ingenuity, that ability to see beyond what the normative says is very intriguing to me. So the next slide. So, when this is a project that was done in Detroit, it was faced with these sort of neglected spaces around bus stops where the buses took hours to come. There was no place to sit. In the summertime, you couldn't buy ice cream because by the time you got home, it was water. So we worked on just trying to figure out ways in which we can sort of at least provide a humane space for people in that neighborhood. So we took the same kind of thinking about discarded materials. They were tearing down a lot of homes in Detroit. Things were going in landfills. So what can we do with this material, man? Not only are the landfills filling up, but they're filling up in our neighborhood. So maybe we can do something and we don't have to sit around and watch these ugly hills grow. So next slide. So we took doors. We took doors that were being torn out. We took as many studs as we could possibly find. We hired artists from the neighborhoods, and we sort of combined all that into creating these bus stops. We call them door stops, actually, where at least, we can't make the buses run faster, but we can at least give you a seat while you're waiting, right? And we can also hire artists to do this, so they get a little money and a little pride because the pieces that they design are in their neighborhoods. So this is sort of this thinking about what do you do with space when it doesn't want to bend to your will, when it doesn't want to allow you to be a normal human being, right? Do you wait or do you take action? Next slide. This is also a very small project, but also embodies a lot of that sort of hip hop mentality. Typically corners, especially corners in African American neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods, marginalized neighborhoods, are seen as problematic. People hanging on the corner. Although this is where doo-wop was born, right? But they often are targeted as places that that need to be policed and surveyed. So this is a project by Formula and James's office, and in partnership with a landscape architecture firm in Minneapolis called 10 by 10. And next slide. They created this portable, malleable, for lack of a better term, box. I know it's got a better term for that. Where it's available to most anyone in the community. If you want to have a celebration there, you can. If you want to have a rally there, you can. If you want to have a picnic there, you can. It's a way to sort of reclaim that particular location, that idea of the corner as problematic, and from a local perspective. Okay, and then the last slide is you can't really sort of talk about the possibilities of hip hop architecture without talking about Lex work. And I'm sure you've seen all this before, but it really is really quite powerful. These are images of he calls it megacities. I think it's called megacities. And this is Lagos in the future. But again, you see this idea of using materials locally to sort of, create spaces, even on top of spaces that were considered normal, right? And you create this sort of new kind of thinking, spatially, visually, that support the life of the people who are in that location. Okay, so that's the end of my diatribe. That was the end of my slides. So there you have it.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. That was an amazing set of ideas and a lot to think about and process. I'm really glad that we have this recorded so people can go back and refer to it as well, because you gave a lot a lot to grapple with, both in the sense of the models of hip hop architecture and then some of the practice of it as well. So thank you so much for that. I know we have a lot of questions already in the chat box, so I'm just going to ask you one question, which actually takes off from that last example, which I suppose one could think of in terms of Afrofuturism, perhaps. That might be one lens that you might want to look at his work.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask you, given that you started as a practicing architect yourself, and that you've also spoken very powerfully on the question of representation within architectural and design practice, if you would just say a little bit about the originators of architecture, and also maybe even the client base for architecture, and ways that those things might need to change in line with the kind of spatial models that you've described. So who gets to build and how?
Well, first I want to sort of maybe reinforce this idea that, within hip hop architecture, we are probably as interested, if not more interested, in process as much as object or product. We both see architecture both as a noun and a verb. And so if you think about that as a model for practice, it's very different than sort of traditional architectural practice, which sees, for lack of, they see the most most traditional firms, and this is not a knock on traditional firms, it's just my observation, see the end product of their work as being an object. And it's not surprising because that's how they've been taught. And that's usually what the client comes into the door wanting to have at the end of the day. But what if we thought about, architecture is not trying to get rid of the object at all, but it's not just the object. What if we thought about practicing architecture was about educating the citizens to the benefits of the public realm? What if we try to provide folks with the kind of language which allows them to participate in conversations at the city government level, at the developers table? So they don't feel like they don't know what they're talking about. What if architecture decided that, maybe the best solution for this project that my client just brought me isn't a building. Maybe it's something else. And is it my role to suggest that? And if I really believe that is the case, then maybe I shouldn't take this project. And all these things tend to upset the traditional way of thinking about work. But I also think that to do this kind of rethinking, we need different voices in the field. We need people like myself, people who have traditionally been locked out of architecture, whose voices, even within architecture, are sorely needed, but very, very infrequently heeded. If we're restructuring the way in which firms operate, then we are actually asking our client base or our potential client base to rethink how they're doing their work. And they will actually look for firms that can perhaps help them rethink these traditional models of production. And for me, that it's a really sort of personal thing for me, because I think that kind of approach allows for more people of color to enter into the profession, feeling like they actually have something to say and people are going to listen to them and they can actually produce the kinds of work that they really feel passionate about. It also requires us to teach differently. And it also allows for, this is a really, really irritating thing for me, for firms that, especially Black firms, that spend years creating a cadre of clients, of work, and then the principal of that firm passes, and eventually that firm dissipates because either they haven't been trained, someone hasn't been trained to take over, or those relationships that the principal has sort of dissipate over time because of whatever reason. And so when you look and you see that KPF and other firms have 50 to 60 to 100 years run as an existing firm, you don't see a whole lot of Black firms like that. Mm. They almost have to start over from scratch every single time a principal passes. That just shouldn't happen. That just should not happen. And so again, when I think sort of rethinking the structure of practice itself could help address and maybe even alleviate some of these concerns.
Yeah, I think you've also just made so clear there the parallels between the calls for reconceptualizing the social fabric that we're hearing in the recent protests, which you talked about during your lecture, and what needs to happen in architecture. It's a very thorough and deep set of questions that you're posing to the shape of the discipline. So thank you for that. We have a couple of questions. I'm first going to go ahead and read some questions from Stephen Burks. Sure. Who's tuned in, but he can't ask the questions directly at the moment. So I'm just going to try to read them out. So first he says, you've compared the hip hop architecture movement to constructivism, modernism, and deconstructivism. Typically, the architecture of each of these movements was born from an innovation in building construction or technology. For modernism, it was steel and glass construction. For deconstruction, it was CAD, computer design, that made the architecture possible. Where is the architectural or design innovation that distinguishes hip-hop architecture? And then he continues, you say you don't want to commercialize this movement or name it, but you've already named and defined it. Don't you think that, quote, our ownership of this movement can be different from the others' commercialization of hip-hop? And I think there he's talking about the commercialization of hip-hop music, maybe, for example.
Yeah, no, I've defined it for me. I haven't defined it for the field. So I've defined it for this conversation, but I in no way, shape, or form is what I have sort of identified as definitive. It's a work in progress. So I'd like to make that clear. Okay. And it's an interesting question about the innovation. I teach a class about design activism and social justice course, and I encourage my students to learn as much about the technology that's available right now, robotics and CNC routers and all the other sorts of things that folks that allow you to do interesting things quickly, fast, more efficiently. And a lot of that technology is mobile, right? A lot of that stuff you can put in a suitcase. And so you can carry it to, West Virginia. You can take it to the middle of Alabama. You can take it overseas. So in my sense, sort of the technology, it frees practitioners, especially young practitioners, from having to sit in an office and beg to do work. You can go create your own work because you have an office and a production in a case. You can go, buy, do it. Don't ask permission, right? Just go and do it. The other thing that I wanted to sort of add to that is, while I encourage folks to become more technologically savvy, I also want to add a caveat, is that there's something to be said, a lot to be said, for local production knowledge. How things have been done, how things can be done. Like, you might be able to take that suitcase with you, but when you leave, you take that suitcase away. And if what is done is not sustainable, then have you really done anything at all? So yes, it's great to be as technologically savvy as you possibly can, but that has to be tied to an idea that technology isn't a savior; it's a tool, and there are other tools that are available as well. And maybe technology becomes a tool of last resort. And so, that's kind of how I would respond to that question. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Craig. Let's get to Malcolm Smith. Malcolm, I see you there typing, and thanks for all your comments in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask a couple of these questions directly to Craig?
Sure, I could do that. Hello, thank you for having this. Happy to be here. I'm a clay artist, ceramicist, and teacher by trade, and I'm once former and always will be participant in hip hop as a graffiti artist, break dancer, and beatboxer. I try to infuse all that in my teaching and to share those vectors for students that don't have that at all. But I'm very curious as to know how the agency of resistance that you speak of in ways in the intro of the whole discussion, talking about spaces and the legit spaces and the spaces that we invent for ourselves. How is that action of resistance going to manifest itself within this sort of architectural format? The fact that it will, even with the example of the museum in the Bronx, is it the Bronx that Unity Hip Hop Museum is coming?
Yeah, it's coming. Yes, it's Universal Hip Hop Museum, and yeah, that's going to be in the Bronx.
So even in that moment, to think about housing graffiti seems antithetical. I mean, it seems like it wants to resist cataloging in that way. It wants to resist being displayed. And so how will that manifest itself through this architectural movement?
Well, I kind of agree with you on that. And this might be semantics, but for me, it's much more. I think it's much more about. I think it's more than semantics. Like, I wouldn't call it a museum, because the moment you call something a museum, then it's things are it's dead. I mean, it's just sort of it is a that's the whole purpose of museums, right? And at the very least, I wish they would call it an archive, not a museum. It's an archive. You're sort of collecting things, but that's saying that things are still alive. Things are still moving. There's still more to bring in. In my opinion, the term museum fossilizes everything. It's frozen. Now that's it. End of story. Now you've got to go through certain hoops to be included in this. When you're archiving, you just grab it. You just grab it and you put it in, and you put it inside. So that's one thing. The way in which I think this idea of sort of resistance and ownership comes into play. The last two projects that I just sort of mentioned is that nobody asked permission to do that. They just did it. You just took that space over and you made it what you needed it to be, so that you could live a marginally better life, right? So these small sort of urban acupunctures, these sort of interventions can become linked. They can grow. They can become, how many vacant lots do we have in any city that we live in, right? They don't have to just be things that are just left to rot. They can be usurped. They can be engaged. They can be the foundation for creating a space that is supportive rather than one that is detrimental to life. So hopefully that begins to answer the question.
Thank you so much, Malcolm, for that question. We're just about to time now, but I'm just going to see if Stephen wants to jump in for a last word, because I think he's been able to get his technology going. Stephen, are you out there?
I just had 2 questions from this guy, man. Let me get somebody else out here. Gee, my knees.
Stephen, do you want to say hi, or should I go to a different question as Craig's requesting?
We can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah.
Oh, you still can't? Okay.
Okay, no problem. Well, maybe I'll just sort of wrap up with something that he raised, which I was also wondering about, which is in that distinction between insistence and rejection that you talked about, and you linked the idea of insistence to the current protests. Stephen had put in the chat box, you know, in a way, what's the goal here? Does the movement seek to move the marginalized to the accepted? Maybe shifting the concept of what is normative. I know that's kind of a big question to leave it on, but do you see this as having a kind of progressive movement from insistence to rejection to something else that's still being defined? Or how would you define the kind of end of this trajectory or the next step in the trajectory?
You know, I'm of the bell hooks school of thought about margins. I like margins. I like being in them. I like not having to sort of bend to a will that typically does not want to accept the kinds of things that I'm interested in or the kinds of things that I think are urgent. Now, if somebody wants to come along, that's fine, right? If they don't, that's fine as well. The work is not going to stop. I think for me, and I'm not speaking for everybody else who is sort of who are working in the same sort of genre, or at least with the same ideas. I'm interested in pushing the boundaries of architecture and what we are expected to do and what we should be doing. Mm-hmm. Do I think, so this might be a real easy, I'll answer it this way. So Sekou Cook, who did who curated the exhibition, I came to the opening in St. Paul. There was a panel in St. Paul, and I said that, you know what, I wish that hip hop architecture doesn't exist. And he was like, what are you talking about? It's like, I said, I wish hip hop architecture was just architecture.
Mm. So there was no.
That's for me, Stephen, that's the teleology. That it's not just hip hop architecture, it's just architecture. Mm. Period. End of story.
That's a beautiful way to end. Olivia Swider did have, I'm just going to go ahead and ask this question. Is there anything you would recommend to read right now? She just says top of mind. Anything?
Without sounding self-serving, anything I've written, you can read that. Amen. Anything I have written, you can read that. But yeah, no, it depends on what your interest is. I mean, I could, you know, is it about hip hop itself? Is it about the convergence of hip hop and architecture? Is it about, I mean, honestly, I'm being serious. I don't know how to respond because I don't know what the interest is.
Okay.
And feel free to email me later. And you know, we can sort of flesh that out, I'm very accessible that way. So
I also love what you said about people doing their own work, and I feel like a lot of the energy and ideas that you're bringing to the table here are incredibly inspiring to do just that. So thank you very much for that, Craig. I just want to let folks know on Monday, of course, we have another Design and Dialogue coming up, and we're going to be sticking with the theme of architecture, but going all the way around the world to China. And we're going to be hearing from Mr. Zhu Pei, who is one of China's leading architects, maybe best known recently here in the States for the Jingdezhen Imperial Kiln Museum, which is an extraordinary building that takes its sort of inspiration from the kiln buildings themselves. So a very good example, actually, Craig, of that kind of local resource and local knowledge you were talking about. So please tune in for that on Monday. And Craig, listen, thank you so much for all the wisdom and insights you shared with us today. It's hugely appreciated.
Well, I'm glad to have been invited. And I'm glad to see 7 o'clock in the morning in Portland.
New experience. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Okay, ciao, everyone.
Ciao.